It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. If you, like me, have read Pride and Prejudice a dozen times, then you probably recognize those words as the opening line of Jane Austen's famous novel and our introduction to life in Regency-era England. Jane Austen's world is a far cry from the ancient Middle Eastern setting of today's Old Testament reading. But I have to confess that these words were taking up space in the back of my brain as I worked my way through the betrothal scene of Genesis 24 earlier this week. Because they could have been written as a setup for this very story. A man in need of a wife is a plot device that is both universal and timeless, occurring across all genres of literature. Every good story has a central conflict or problem that needs to be solved, and this problem is at the center of today's story. 40-year-old Isaac, a single man in possession of a good fortune, is in want of a wife. That, in and of itself, might not seem like much of an obstacle to overcome, but Isaac isn't just any person. He is the son of Abraham and Sarah. And as we have heard over the past several weeks of lectionary readings, Abraham and his wife Sarah have entered into a covenant with God. God has promised to give them descendants that are as numerous as the stars in the sky. This covenantal relationship has been tried and tested seemingly on both sides. Abraham and Sarah taking matters into their own hands when Abraham fathers a son with Hagar, their subsequent cruelty and banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, and then God's command to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. But here we are on the other side of all of that, and Isaac, the promised son, is grown and he is more than old enough to get married. If the promise is to come true, if Abraham is to be the ancestor of a multitude of nations, then Isaac must marry and have children of his own. Perhaps another way of framing today's reading from Genesis 24 is this: will the covenant, will God's promise pass on to the next generation? The problem of finding a wife for Isaac is complicated by the fact that Abraham does not want his son to marry a Canaanite, the people among whom they live. He wants Isaac to marry a woman from Abraham's kinfolk, from his family. So Abraham calls his chief servant, a man whose name we are not given, and makes him swear an oath to go and to find a wife for Isaac from Abraham's people. The servant senses the weight of this task, and he asks this question: what if I find a woman, but she isn't willing to leave her home and travel back here with me? Should I bring Isaac back there instead? But Abraham says, no, Isaac must stay here. Abraham assures his servant that God will be with him and grant him success on his quest. And then he tells him that if he finds a woman, but she is not willing to go back with him, he is released from his oath. The servant takes 10 of his master's camels. He gathers supplies for his journey, including all kinds of gifts, and he sets out for Abraham's home country, to the city of Nahor. When he gets there, he finds the well outside the city, and he stops to rest and water his animals. The servant knows that it's just about evening, the time of day when women come out to gather water from the well, and so he prays this prayer: God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. I am standing here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I say, please offer your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for my servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Any woman may be likely to offer a drink of water to a thirsty stranger, but to draw water for 10 camels, when a single camel can drink something like 20 to 30 gallons of water, this would be an extraordinary act of kindness, not to mention stamina and strength. Before the servant has even finished his prayer, Rebekah shows up on the scene. Readers of Genesis have already been introduced to Rebekah back in chapter 22, where she is listed in a brief genealogy of the family of Abraham's brother. And that is where we learn that her father, Bethuel, is the first cousin of Isaac. So when she appears at the well, we know that she is a relation of Abraham and Isaac, but the servant does not know this yet. She goes to the well, fills up her water jar, and then the servant approaches her and asks for a drink of water. And as if on cue, Rebekah offers to water the camels as well, even going so far as to add until they are finished drinking. Once she's watered the camels, it's the moment of truth. The servant gets out his betrothal gifts, a gold nose ring and 2 arm bracelets, and he asks her who her family is and whether he can find lodging with them. She identifies her family and invites him to stay. The servant now understands that she is from Abraham's family, and he bows his head in what I can only imagine is in gratitude and relief, and he prays a prayer of blessing for what God has done. Rebekah runs ahead to her mother's house to tell her family what's happened. Laban, her brother, sees her wearing these expensive betrothal gifts. He hears Rebekah's story, and right away he recognizes that this family is wealthy. This is a serious offer of marriage, and Laban is no fool. So he rushes out to greet the servant and to show him hospitality. Once the animals have been cared for and he and his men have washed their feet from the long journey, the servant sits down to a meal, but he will not eat until he has stated his mission. So he recounts his story, which is what we heard read in this morning's lectionary reading, a first-person account of his journey and of this scene at the well. And after he tells his story, Laban and his father Bethuel remark to the servant that what has transpired is from the Lord, and they give their blessing for this marriage to take place. The servant wants to go back to Abraham right away, but the family wants Rebekah to remain for 10 days, likely to make sure that things are in order and maybe even for her own protection, to make sure that this betrothal offer is truly as good as it seems, because all of this has come together very quickly. So Rebekah gets called in to ask if she will stay or go, a rare moment of personal autonomy in this culture of arranged marriage. Rebekah says yes and goes with their blessing to travel to meet her new husband-to-be. Isaac, we learn, has just come from a journey of his own, also to a well, Beer Lahai Roi, Hagar's well, and he is settled in the Negeb. Rebekah sees him from a distance, quickly gets off her camel, confirms his identity, that he is in fact her betrothed, and then she covers herself with a veil in preparation of meeting him. They meet and marry, and Isaac brings her into his mother's tent, the sign that the mantle has been passed. Rebekah is now the matriarch of the family. Isaac loves her, and he finds comfort after his mother's death. At first, it doesn't seem like God has much to do with the events of the story, at least not directly. The narrative doesn't portray God as speaking or actively working in the same way that we see in earlier points of Abraham and Isaac's story. But there is more going on here than meets the eye. Weaving its way through this narrative is this belief that God is present, that God is faithful to Abraham and to the covenant that God has made with Abraham, that God is leading the actions of the servant, and that God will provide. The actions of God might not be obvious, but the people within the story operate under the assumption that God is at work behind the scenes. This is a story of faith. It serves as a reminder to God's people that we can trust in the promises of God. This trust is not without risk. Abraham's servant doesn't know if his quest will be successful. He has sworn to find a wife for his master, but he must go on a long and arduous journey. He must find an eligible woman from among Abraham's people, and he must find someone who actually is willing to travel back with him, a stranger, to a new and unknown land. And yes, Abraham does give him an out. But the power dynamic here is not one of equals. They're not friends, they're not brothers. Abraham is his master. What if he does find the right woman and she refuses to come back with him? Will Abraham believe that he's truly done his part and release him from his oath? And the risk here isn't just personal risk for the servant, it's a question of the covenant between Abraham and God. The servant must put his trust in Abraham's God and in God's commitment to this covenant. We don't know if he himself worships Abraham's God. When he prays, he addresses God as the God of Abraham. But even so, he prays to Abraham's God to ask for help. And when he is successful in finding Rebekah, he prays a prayer of gratitude and blessing. He understands what is at stake, and he chooses to put his trust in Abraham's God. This trust also involves communal discernment. When the servant prays that God would make clear the identity of Isaac's bride, he comes up with very specific parameters that when he asks for a drink, she must offer water for his camels too. It seems like an arbitrary test. He simply asks God for a sign, and if a woman appears to make such an offer, he will chalk it up to divine favor. But it's not just his own discernment that allows him to determine that God has answered his prayer. When he explains his story to Rebekah's father and brother and asks whether they will accept this offer of marriage, they respond, "The thing comes from the Lord. We cannot speak to you anything bad or good." Even they, men who most likely worship different gods, seem to recognize that Abraham's God has guided his servant. And when Rebekah is presented with the option to remain behind or go with Abraham's servant, she too is given the chance to affirm that what has transpired is from the Lord. Rebekah says yes, and the communal discernment continues. At the heart of the servant's trust in the promises of God is his belief in God's goodness. In his prayer at the well before meeting Rebekah, he asks God to show steadfast love to his master Abraham. And in his prayer of blessing after he meets Rebekah, he says this, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master." The servant trusts God to keep God's promises because he understands that God is a God of steadfast love and faithfulness. God is not fickle or forgetful. God's very character is one of loving kindness and of loyalty. When the servant is first commissioned with his task, Abraham assures him that God will lead him and grant him success. Abraham is confident that God will help his servant find a wife for Isaac because God has promised to bless Abraham and to bless his descendants. God has provided for him every step of the way, and Abraham has no reason to think that God will stop now. God's people can depend on the promises of God because God's very nature is one of love and faithfulness. And the beautiful thing about trusting in the promises of God is that these promises are not just for a selected few. The covenant that Abraham has with God is unique, but God is not only the God of Abraham. I love the subtle nod to Hagar that we have at the end of this passage, Isaac's visit to Beer Lahai Roi, because it reminds us that it is not Abraham who is the first person in Scripture to assign God a name, but Hagar, his female Egyptian slave. As Rebecca Letterman reminded us last Sunday, in Genesis 16, we have this account of conflict between Sarai and Hagar after Hagar becomes pregnant with Abraham's son, Ishmael. Sarai treats her harshly, and so Hagar runs away. An angel of the Lord finds her by a spring of water in the wilderness and promises to her that God will multiply her offspring to be so numerous that they cannot be counted. Hagar names God El Roi, the God of seeing, or the God who sees. And the well where she encounters God is Beer Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. God is not just the God of Abraham and Isaac, God is the God of Hagar. And God is the God of Rebekah. If you've been paying close attention to today's Old Testament reading, it should make you a little uncomfortable. This is an arranged marriage and a patriarchal culture. You'll notice that Rebekah's husband is chosen for her by her father and brother. Laban and Bethuel accept the servant's marriage proposal without consulting Rebekah because this was the practice. This was the norm. It's clear that this passage is neither a model of egalitarian relationships or a how-to guide on finding the right spouse. Rebekah's world, her cultural context is not ours, but I love that even with her cultural constraints, the text gives her voice and agency. When the servant asks her for help at the well, she is quick to give it. She's generous. She takes action. She offers to water his camels until they have finished drinking. She offers him hospitality in their household, and she runs ahead to tell her family the news of what has just happened to her. You get the sense that Rebekah is not the kind of person that just sits back and waits for things to happen to her. And when something unusual does occur, when she is actually consulted by her father and brother as to whether she will stay behind for 10 more days or go now, Rebecca steps out in faith. As Catherine Sifferdecker observes, Rebecca herself does not hesitate to go. She is not only strong, but decisive, a characteristic that will continue in later stories about her. She, like Abraham before her, leaves home and family to travel to a land she has never seen. Rebecca chooses to put her trust in Abraham's God, and in doing so, Abraham's God becomes her God. The promise of God's faithfulness extends to Rebecca, and it extends to us. Abraham's descendants become the children of Israel, the people who are chosen and set apart to bear witness to God's goodness and faithfulness in the world. And throughout Scripture, we see this promise expanded to include the Gentiles, culminating in the life and mission of the early church when God's Spirit falls on Jewish and Gentile believers alike. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news that God became flesh and defeated sin and death in order that all of creation might be redeemed and restored. This is good news for every last one of us. The promise of God's faithfulness is not limited to the elect. It's not based on our own merit or contingent on our own faithfulness. It is a gift that is offered freely. I recognize that it's easy to stand behind a pulpit and to declare that we can trust in the promises of God. There's not a lot of risk involved in that. It's another thing entirely to put your trust in the promises of God when you are sitting in a hospital room or staring at a pile of bills that you don't know how to pay, or crying out to God for help only to be met with silence. This is the life of faith, to cling to the promises of God and to trust in the faithfulness of God, even when on the surface it doesn't look like God is at work. And this is no small thing. So if you find yourself struggling to do this, to trust in God's goodness or to believe that God's promises are for you, may you find comfort in the knowledge that Christ is the image of God, the one who reveals to us who God is and what God is like. Jesus, the one who knows our humanity, who experienced poverty and oppression, abandonment and betrayal, who suffered and died, did all of this out of love for us. This is who God is, a God who came to us, who knows our pain, and who is with us even now. We heard other words of promise this morning, Jesus' words of invitation in the gospel reading. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's an unusual picture, even an absurd one, this image of putting on a yoke, this wooden crosspiece used by work animals like oxen or horses to pull a plow. How is this an image of rest? And yet Jesus promises respite for those who are weary, those who are carrying heavy burdens. Discipleship is not easy or carefree. It requires something of us. But when we follow Jesus, we are given the gift of his ongoing presence that sustains us, presence that is the source of deep, abundant life. It doesn't mean the details of our lives magically fall into place or that we will be free from any of life's troubles or complexities, but it does mean that Christ himself will be with us. He promised it. And we can trust that the one who is faithful will do it. In the arms of our good shepherd, we find our rest. Thanks be to God.